right, good afternoon, everybody. Last session, let's keep it high energy and fun. Welcome to our talk, Unmasking Hidden Danger, the role of insider threat pen testing. I am Ian Trumbull, manager with Insider Risk. Been at Google for about a year, but been in cyber for about 15 years.
Hi everyone, my name is Shahzad Azad. I'm a technical manager on the Google Mandiant Global Insider Risk Services team. I have extensive background in cybersecurity across multiple disciplines, and then also extensive background in insider risk, both in consulting as well as the financial industry, where I served as the Global Deputy Insider Risk Lead at UBS. And it's very fitting that it's Insider Threat Awareness Month, and we're discussing this topic, so thank you all for joining, and hopefully you enjoy our presentation.
All right, so we will be talking about what is going on with the insider risk space, who these insiders are, why we made our product, and ultimately, what is the solution? So this first slide talks about there is a change with the workforce. And this comes to, people who are walking away with data. It is happening in the companies. But there is a shift. We have our older workforce who have the mindset that says, hey, I made it on the company hardware, right? It belongs to the organization, where we are seeing a shift with the younger generation, Gen Z, that says, hey, I made this and I want to take this with me out the door.
And that brings us a few questions. Number one, are organizations over-trusting of their workforce? Number two, is it a procedural gap with regards to the employee offboarding process and the enhanced monitoring for leavers? Is it a lack of visibility from a cyber perspective? Or is it essentially a lack of partnership between HR and cybersecurity in sharing that information on leavers to be able to do that enhanced monitoring? These are all questions that we'll uncover further over the course of the presentation. So in the last decade or so, there's been a proliferation in data through expanding networks, endpoints, IoT devices, applications, cloud environments. And all that's done is increase the attack surface for malicious insiders to exploit confidential and sensitive data. As in the 2023 Tesla case. This wasn't Tesla's first go around with insider threat incidents, as they experienced a prior one in 2018, where a disgruntled employee was not only able to leak sensitive data, but also sabotage internal source code and systems. So this is a trend we're going to continue to see, and we've already actually seen an uptick in this since 2023 and also for the years to come.
And the last point that we want to talk about is that we have more and more former employees who still have access to this data. And what are they doing with it? Can you actually see how they use this data when they leave the company? Now, this, of course, will lead to breaches, company trust being violated, and this can be pretty bad on the company's share price. Now, this next slide is very timely. We heard about it this morning in the keynote, but this is KnowBe4 incident, right? And we heard about thousands of North Korean employees are actually getting jobs inside of these US companies. They are actually bypassing HR, getting through everything. Now, KnowBe4 was lucky in this sense. Once the employees got in, they got access, they got laptops. Well, as soon as they got their laptops, first thing they did was try to install malware, and they got caught.
And this represents a shifting tactic that nation states are now utilizing. They're not simply exploiting, manipulating insiders from organizations, but now bypassing those preventative and mitigative controls from a background screening, employee screening perspective, and gaining full employment, either as an FT or a contractor. So as Ian mentioned, not just the downstream alerting, but now organizations also need to be extra vigilant on these preventative and mitigative capabilities as well. So how much do insider threats actually cost? Well, in 2023, the average annual cost for insider threat incidents was $16.2 million. But what's astounding is that when organizations took longer than 91 days to contain and respond to an incident, that figure jumped to $18.3 million. And you might be thinking to yourself, 91 days seems kind of high, and we'll kind of break that down further as to why it takes organizations that long to effectively contain and respond to insider threat incidents. It's important to note that these figures don't include fraud cases, as the figure would be much higher. And in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to ransomware breaches, this cost may not seem so high, but it usually comes as an unplanned, unforeseen expense that can essentially stretch cyber budgets thin.
And the other question most orgs ask is saying, can we afford this $16.2 million, right? Even if they have cyber insurance, there's a chance that they may not even get the full payout, and that could be due to a number of factors, right? They could have certain things in their policy that says you're not getting full payout. Why? Well, because you've got unapproved vendors that you're working with, lack of proper cybersecurity training, right? And also lack of robust controls. And this also will lead to the other unforeseen cost. We got brand damage, reputational damage, which of course compound the fact of the loss of business revenue. And this is going to bring us into programmatic cost and consequences. And the most shocking number on this slide is that 86 days. And we're saying that on average, it takes about 86 days to contain these insider incidents. And as we are, doing our job, talking to clients, getting information, a couple of questions and a couple of themes keep coming up. The first question we see is who is handling this? And why? Well, that's because there is a lack of proper foundation, especially with insider risk programs. Second question, does this need to be escalated, right? If so, if I'm so, who, where? But the most common thing we're seeing across our trends is, of course, we do not have visibility, right? Your insider team, your SOC team doesn't know what's going on with this insider population. And the last number is that 90%. And we're seeing that, most of your insider risk budget program, if you have one, is spent post-breach.
And it isn't a surprise to see the financial industry as the #1 industry at the top of the list impacted by insider threat incidents. And it's because of the regulatory nature of their operating environment and the fees and fines that these organizations may incur, especially with regards to data leakage and especially customer information. It's also not a surprise to see intellectual property as the highest value data type at risk, especially in the current era where a lot of organizations are racing to the top of the AI leaderboard, and we're going to see a lot of jumping around from organization to organization and essentially see this statistic rise. So who are the common insiders? Insiders can be further categorized through different insider risk profiles that you see on the screen. Each of them have their own motivations, their goals, and ultimately a varying degree of impact depending on their tactics, techniques, procedures, targets, and especially their industry. But what's surprising is that the negligent insider accounts for the majority of insider threat incidents. So let's take a recent example from the news, the CrowdStrike incident. There's been a lot of coverage focusing on the misconfiguration piece, obviously the downstream effects, but let's take a slightly different look at this case. We can consider it to be a negligent insider case where the actions misactions, or in this case, misconfigurations of a user or user group resulted in essentially widespread global system outages.
And the last insider that we want to highlight, of course, is going to be your classic malicious insider. Even though they account for a much smaller percentage of these incidents, they tend to be the most expensive, with the average being at $648,000 per incident. And this brings us to a change, right? What's going on with the landscape of the current insider threats? So we'll be talking about these in these 4 quadrants here. The first one is that our insider, of course, is becoming more sophisticated. They are evolving. They've got a lot more new motivations and new tools, and that's because they have been able to rapidly adapt to lots of cloud software, lots of cloud adoptions, and this only increased during the pandemic. And we talked about this before. This has led to lots of accidental insider breaches. Famous example that you probably know of is Samsung, right? Lots of their employees started to leak confidential Samsung data into ChatGPT, right? Which is not good. Point number 2, rise in the workforce. Again, this has been a big change. Suddenly, the 4 walls are gone, and now we're having to protect the same workforce, right, in their home. And as an organization, some were able to adopt, but some were not. You have to ask yourself, with this change in this remote workforce, did your visibility increase or decrease?
And that brings us to point number 3, rise in espionage. As Kevin mentioned in his keynote, nation states are evolving. They're not simply just manipulating, exploiting insiders from these organizations, these institutions, these government bodies, but now actually planting their own and bypassing those preventative and mitigative controls. And it's especially compounded by the remote workforce. And it's extra, difficult to be able to effectively prevent and mitigate from a remote workforce perspective. And that brings us to point number 4. There's been a lot of economic uncertainty, especially in the last few years, through rising costs, through rising inflation. Perhaps a spouse has lost their job, and that's essentially squeezing out families. But it's also creating the perfect breeding ground for the disgruntled and opportunistic employee who may want to or feel the need to exploit their organization for personal gain. So let's talk about the growing imbalance. Well, I like to start off with this joke usually, but if Ian and I were to have $1 for every time an organization said, yeah, we have a tool for this, we have a technology for combating insider threats, I think we'd be able to retire by now. But that's what we're seeing, is an emphasis on tools and technology, but not enough emphasis on the tactical response, which is the glue to be able to effectively contain and respond to insider threat incidents. Do you have the proper alerting in place? Do you know how to action the alerts? Do you have the proper investigative workflows? As Ian mentioned prior, do you know who to escalate to? These are all factors that, once again, attribute to that 86-day containment statistic that we mentioned earlier. On top of that, just a few contributing factors to highlight. Number 1, the incomplete audit trail. So a lot of organizations may have some of the tooling in place, your data loss prevention, you may have a SIM, you may have web proxy, but if they're not tuned properly and you don't have the proper insider threat use cases, it's going to become really difficult to paint that complete audit trail. And also, if you factor in additional data that you might require, especially from an HR perspective, from a physical data security perspective, it becomes increasingly challenging to have that complete picture, which once again contributes to that 86-day statistic. On top of that, 91% of cybersecurity budgets are focused on external threat actors, so it is pretty obvious from that we're seeing an imbalance and not enough insider threat use cases, which further compounds the problem.
And the last points, first one is inadequate resourcing. And this means that, you could have all the tools in the world, but you might not know what you're looking for. The other thing, of course, we have many orgs, right, who might have an insider team, and that's pretty rare. But even if they do, they don't have full autonomy. They're often sharing resources with the SOC, right? And this is not good for them. There's also lots of shared responsibilities. And this could be, again, lack of ownership. We're seeing scope creep of job duties, not having the proper insider training mindset as well. Because again, most of our training is still focused on the external threats out there, right? The other thing we're seeing is, just like with many teams, your analysts are always putting out fires, right? Nothing new there. But this leads to a lack of know-how, right? And then you've got the other problem where someone's going to leave the organization, someone's going to change your team. And this tends to be this vicious cycle, especially with the insider threat teams, which means that your insider threat problem is never really dealt with. And the last bullet here, unclear responsibilities. Like we said before, if your teams don't know when to escalate, how to escalate, who to escalate to, this incident is going to keep getting dragged on and on and on. Again, leading back to that 86-day number that we talked about previously. So, what is the solution? All right. Well, we love the external pen test. It has its place. It has its value. And we said, well, what if we were to shift it, right? Go 180 and take a look at it from the inside, from the Insider Threat PenTest. And that's why we came up with our Insider Threat PenTest. But before we get into more of the details, let's break down some quick differences between the external pen test and the insider pen test. And the first one, of course, starts with the perspective, right? Your classic pen test starts with the perspective of the external attacker, and your insider pen test starts with someone already in the company, your trusted insider.
Another easy way to break it down is to look at the goals and motivations of each. So from a traditional pen test perspective, the goal is to exploit perimeter defenses, vulnerabilities, misconfigurations from the outside in. Whereas from an insider threat pen test perspective, the goal is really to exploit sensitive or confidential data or systems through existing access to really test the breadth of the resulting audit trail or lack thereof through targeted access levels, personas, especially the insider risk profiles that we mentioned, and so forth. And we'll break that down further in the next slides.
So let's discuss how we actually do this pen test, right? So first thing Insider Threat PenTest does is it's going to establish clear goals with the organization. It's going to have shared objectives, right, and also beneficial outcomes. And this leads to our use cases that the Insider PenTest works with the organization. These will be tailored for everyone's own unique needs.
And this is where you can leverage a model-based classification ontology, as you see on the screen. First and foremost, you want to start at the top level, which is the use case category level. We have about 10 or so listed on the screen. I'm going to highlight about 4 of them that we think are really important. But top of the list, data exfil, both from a low-hanging fruit perspective, so personal webmail, for example, all the way to more sophisticated attack vectors through testing different network protocols. You have data exposure, also once again with that same lens. Are you seeing data, sensitive data in your collaboration platform, for example, and to actually enumerating the environment to discover data. Malicious actions, which can encompass a number of these categories, so endpoint compromise, account compromise, privilege abuse is a big one, especially over permissive access that we see often. And then finally, levers. You really want to consider this category, especially because you want to see and test the sequence of events and the resulting audit trail from an employer contractor perspective who's essentially leaving the organization. Once you have those use case categories defined, you want to start building out your use case. So this is where you get a little bit more granular. You're going to be focusing on specific applications. You know, maybe it's an application that you just deployed, you just released, and you want to essentially test it from an insider threat perspective with regards to over-permissive access. It could be around sensitive and confidential data that you want to test, especially from a DLP perspective, for example. And then that brings us to the last bit, which is at the indicator level. So taking that a step further, aligning those use cases to specific indicators. So behavioral, accessing certain data resources, data repositories at odd hours, for example. Technical indicators, you know, from an exfil perspective, it could be, you know, FTP, SSH, and so forth, and really testing those vectors and bringing those into light. And then finally, organizational, which are really specific to your organization. So it could be compliance-driven. It could be, for example, unauthorized applications and the downloads of those applications. So really specific to your organization there.
And then next, the Insider PenTest is going to work with the org, right? We want to model those targeted insider behaviors that we just discussed, right? What are they going to do? We can work with the org to, you know, shape that narrative.
And this is where you can essentially fine-tune those use cases even further by first aligning the access levels that you want to test. So number one recommendation, definitely test your default basic user groups. We oftentimes, you know, have seen over-permissive access in the course of our testing, you know, rights being added on but not taken away. Then your middle tier users, and then, you know, more importantly, your privileged users, who are going to be your R&D engineers, your software engineers, your admins, who have that unfettered access to the environment and can do a lot of damage. And then further, as we mentioned with those different insider risk profiles, you're going to essentially assign those personas. So looking at it from a disgruntled employee lens, from a opportunistic lens, and then, you know, really important one is the lever lens, and really testing that sequence of events once again prior to an employer contractor's departure.
And then one thing that we like is that we work with the teams, you know, what tools do you have, right? And so that you can see exactly what's going to happen, so that you can actually see how we're going to be doing our test. Next, the pen test begins. We are given some of these accounts along with those different personas, right? And we're going to take a very multidisciplinary approach, and then this is going to form into a nice document, right, with different level mitigations, both at your executive level, but also at your practitioner level. So we've got a couple of things that we want to share based off of what we've done. We call these insider threat indicators, and the first one is going to be our non-tech savvy saboteur. And one thing that we're seeing with this one is that all companies are going to be using software, right? We got Slack, Teams, SharePoint, Jira, but these are actually being turned into glorified file storage, right? File servers for you to put your most sensitive data that we talked about before. You know, in one example, what we did was, you know, we searched for simple phrases like admin name or admin password. And in this example, we actually got a hit to a vCenter server, which powers all of your virtual machines, right? So this is like having someone put a Post-it note with the domain admin and password, of course, giving us the keys to the kingdom.
All right, so scenario 2, we call this one the spy. Requires a little bit of homework to set up. So in this case, we set up a C2 server. You can run, framework of your choosing, Metasploit, for example. In this case, we had Cobalt Strike running. We also, at the same time, registered a new domain. And you can get creative with this depending on your organization, obviously, and assign that domain to your C2 server. And then from there, through your testing machine, you'll essentially want to, in this particular scenario, set up a SSH connection, and through that encrypted channel, try to exfil mock sensitive or confidential data outside of the network. In this scenario, we're just highlighting one method that you can use. Obviously, FTP over HTTPS is another big one that you'd want to test. But really kind of looking at more of those sophisticated exfil scenarios. And that brings us to scenario number 3. We call this one the disgruntled account takeover. This one also requires a bit of homework to set up. So once again, you'll want to set up the C2 server. You'll have a framework of your choosing, or in this case, we used Cobalt Strike. Then on our testing machine, we set up a virtual machine, and really with the purpose of establishing a beacon from the C2 server to the virtual machine, and really with the major goal to bypass EDR. And through that beacon, we were able to deploy testing tools. In this case, we use Rubius, which is credential harvester, and perform Kerberosing against service accounts to extract their essentially password hashes, in this case RC4 hashes, which are more susceptible to brute force attacks than opposed to AES 256, for example. This is usually a big one and one of our go-tos for testing, especially with the sensitive nature, obviously, with service accounts and those accounts having unfettered access to data, resources, in the environment. This one usually grabs senior leadership's eyes and ears. So with all that said, this is your chance to get creative. You want to mix it up. You want to leave as many trails as possible. So from a data exfil perspective, test the webmail access, but also, test exfil through that means, Gmail, Proton Mail. From a OneDrive or SharePoint or other collaboration platforms, try to add an external user through a testing account. See if you can grant that user access. From a leaver perspective, create a sample resume. Try to upload it to job sites. Really, you want to see how many of these trails you're actually going to detect and capture. Also on the leaver side, terminated access is a big one. Especially when your testing is over, you want to essentially see, do you still have access to those environment resources, data, and systems? General risk indicators, just as a quick example, using unmanaged devices to try to access company email or Slack instances or other communication platforms. And then also try to poke holes in your DLP if you have that through bypass and obfuscation. We've seen a lot of simple methods that have bypassed it just with renaming files, with zipping files, and so forth. So this is really a chance to get creative.
And then a couple more, right? Again, what do you know about your network, right? Again, how much can your team see, right, as data is trying to leave the organization? Are you able to actually detect people typing in these commands at your command line, right? Or what about privilege abuse, right? In some of our testing, we've been able to, get creds to companies' social media, right? And then even log in with them. Or even disable things like the VPN, disable services, and to see, again, if that audit trail is being detected, right, by your teams. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are a couple of things that we can do. Of course, you want to review your accounts for that over permissive access, right? It keeps getting added on but never taken away. Next thing, data lifecycle, right? Are you able to see how data is being created, right? And all the way to when it's being destroyed. Are you able to see that in your organization? And of course, we always want to be able to review and restrict any type of traffic leaving the organization. Again, does your team have access to, a firewall, proxy logs, and then can you stop it if need be? So the Insider PenTest, does offer unique value. First one is that it's going to uncover hidden weakness. For example, we have high-risk populations, engineers, contractors, and they might not always see eye to eye when it comes to cyber, right? They might want to go rogue and stand up their own environments, right? We're seen as a hindrance to them, right? And often, one thing we see with these roles is, again, they have lots of access, and they've been grandfathered in, maybe as part of a merger, and these accounts never get checked. So, audit these accounts, right, to make sure that they are not able to justify getting around your controls, right, all in the names of standard business justification. The second one mimics real-world techniques, right? We pride ourselves in the fact that this goes beyond DLP, right, through our tradecraft. Again, what we specialize in is the sequence of activities that your insider persona would do.
And the last 2 points I'll cover quickly, but number one, this is your chance to really test the tactical response, those investigative workflows. Of course, I don't want to negate the alerting and the tooling in place. That's important as well. But really treat this as a purple team exercise. Try to poke holes into where those visibility gaps are, and essentially also partner with your red teams to not only bring in kind of the low-hanging fruit, but also the sophisticated attack vectors to be able to test that full spectrum of insider threats. And then lastly, you can use the results of the Insider Threat PenTest to essentially get buy-in, whether that be additional tooling for visibility, or it may be additional resourcing for an existing insider threat team, or shared resources from a SOC perspective who are serving as the first line triage. Or, the best thing is use it to actually drive support for an actual insider risk program. And this is, a chance to lead from the bottom up and use these data-driven insights to be able to support the need for, program tooling and so forth.
So I just want to leave you with a couple of short, quick takeaways here. One thing is that the insider threats are certainly growing, right? Number two, there is no opportune time for an insider threat incident in any organization.
And you don't want to be part of that 86-day statistics, so shift left and focus on the tactical response initiatives as well, focusing on people and process and not just the technology. Thank you all for joining, and we'll take some questions at this time.
Okay, guys, raise your hand if you have a question. I'll come on over with the mic.
This is great. Have you guys come across any challenges with your program and the way that you've implemented it that you would recommend us thinking about?
I'd say one of the biggest challenges is people do not like the word insider risk, insider threat. It's a very dirty word in any organization. So we can get creative when it comes to what the name is. One of the examples is workforce resilience, I think is a term that is business friendly.
You get creative with those words.
Yeah.
I was going to add on top of that, another challenge is you want to, essentially at this scenario, the use case building phase, you want to incorporate folks like HR and other lines of businesses that, because I think from a cyber perspective, sometimes we have a singular lens and we're looking at specific attack vectors. But speak with HR. Even from a physical security perspective, if you have badge data being logged, this might be a good opportunity to test that. Basically bring in as many stakeholders as possible as part of that scenario development.
I'm coming. Oh, that's okay. Right here.
Have you tried any strategies like random sampling of the population, or things that maybe take away any specific bias or targeting if there's a lack of telemetry about behaviors or activities?
You mean from a detection perspective? Yeah, I think across the board we've seen bits and pieces of these activities being picked up, but in no instance did we see, for example, the complete audit trail, especially with regards to the levers actions that we mentioned. I think that's a more mature programs may have that capability, but organizations that are just starting out, they have their traditional EDRs or SIMs, focus on just the external threats. So you may pick up, the outgoing data piece, but you're not going to pick up perhaps, uploading the resume and, trying to get terminated access, for example, after the testing has been done. So it's really depends on the maturity of the organization, really.
Yeah, some have targeted groups that they know they want to look at, but then sometimes they're saying, wait, this group is doing what? And we've got, and they had no idea.
And actually, one more thing to add on that is, a lot of times we've seen organizations say, well, this particular user group, we know they have unfettered access, and we kind of want to test, that specific role and those specific actions to basically bring light to leadership that, hey, these folks are dangerous with their access, and essentially there needs to be additional controls being placed on top of them.
So maybe getting into the data science aspect, have you looked at maybe creating department level like baselines, based upon anomaly detection of, I guess, kind of who sticks out of the herd, so to speak,
Yeah, that's where we're heading towards. Is we like to put these roles and groups into these different personas and these profiles and an ontology where we think about this exact behavior, what they have access to, and what kind of damage they can do, and then work with the org to check those, right, to see if we're right in the assumptions. But it is a partnership to do that discovery.
Yeah, no, especially from a baselining perspective, obviously when you're setting up the baselining, and if you have the proper tooling in place, for example, like a user activity monitoring capability, it really depends on what you're actually baselining from the get-go with regards to specific use cases and so forth. And that's really what's going to bring the most value and bang for the buck. Otherwise, obviously you'll have to start over, re-baseline, and it can become a pretty cumbersome process from that perspective.
Okay, we have another question here.
Just wondered a couple of things. You mentioned the North Korea, they're trying to get people hired in companies, and obviously they're going to be behaving a little differently after they get hired, potentially. Reminds me of a few years ago, there was a lot of buzz from the FBI and others about the Chinese 10,000 talents plan and everything. Are there sources, like what I was in a briefing once, and I think they were talking about, well, watch for certain websites, and if they're interacting with these types of things or reaching out and contacting these types of people that, might bump up your threat score. Are there sources? I mean, that's maybe just one example, but are there things that companies can do if, say, you don't own a threat intelligence platform for insider monitoring and alerting, right? And you just don't have all these automated tools for these kind of levers. Are there things we can do within our tools and programs like DLP and others that most companies do have to detect some of this activity and start to build some of these alarms and alerts of things available to companies, information?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, right? And the Insider PenTest is designed to work with all your controls that you have in place. And one thing that we like to do is a risk matrix, right? Where we come and talk to the boots on the ground and ask them what is actually going on. What gaps do you know about? And then from there, that can get fleshed out, and then we can start to work on a roadmap into what type of gaps we can close. And then from the other point about websites and traffic, there are threat intel feeds that you can start to ingest into your SIM and your SOAR platforms to take all that data, get it together, and then if you don't have one of these off-the-shelf products, then you got to start to work on thresholds, right? Again, look at the different population, what is normal for the sales team, what is normal for the devs, get that data. It doesn't happen overnight, so we start to target certain populations, do one, and then move on to the next one, iterate until you've got something going.
And just one thing to add to that, I think with all that said, baselining is also important. So, once you get to the point where you're able to capture that data, to start baselining those specific user groups, those departments, really understand, and I think going back to kind of the organizational pieces, right? And those indicators, like what do we as an organization deem risky? Yeah. From an insider threat perspective, because that really varies from organization to organization. Coming from the financial industry, obviously, everything is risky. So, I come from that lens, but, obviously in different operating environments, for startups, that's not going to be the case. So, it really kind of depends on your operating environment as well in that baselining.
Do you have, do you find more practicality out of maybe aligning this with the GRC function as a kind of like auxiliary or supplementary to the compliance aspect of it? So the results from your test kind of highlight where you should prioritize your compliance efforts to maybe gain better detection or decrease the impact from those violations, as opposed to it being a separate unit by itself, because then it's easier to be a scapegoat or to point at as being inefficient and ultimately being more of a cost than the threat itself, right? I don't know if you've...
Yeah, actually, from a GRC perspective, what we often do, especially with regards to the risk matrix that Ian mentioned, is, a good way to start is to start from those enterprise risks. You may have an enterprise risk register already, and it might not be categorized as insider threat, but perhaps there are some risks in there that may be relevant from an insider risk perspective. And I say that because oftentimes organizations they're struggling to get a program off the ground, but if you already align to an existing risk that you may find from that enterprise risk register, it may provide you with that traction to be able to shed light on the insider threat problem. So back to kind of the GRC, yeah, absolutely, but more from an enterprise risk perspective. And oftentimes we see those folks at what we call, from a more programmatic standpoint, the steering committees, and having that top level leadership perspectives from multiple areas, which is obviously key for the program to evolve, grow, mature, and so forth.
Yeah, just due to the nature of it being insider, we partner, with like you said, HR, legal, privacy, right, across the board, in order for these programs to actually, get traction and start to become more built out over time.
Yeah, legal usually barks at us, though.
Legal as well, yeah. But they are important. They are important.
Do you have any recommendations for certifications or programs that help structure building one of these programs? I know of one from CERT, from the Carnegie Mellon organizations, around like 4K, I think it is, but haven't got to that yet. But that one to me looks like it's a valuable resource. Curious what your thoughts are or suggestions.
Yeah, Carnegie Mellon does have a pretty good framework, and they tend to update it over time. So I'd say that's a good start. If you're looking at some of their stuff, then you're on the right page.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of organizations struggle with, you know, especially from a budgeting perspective, you know, CISOs are saying, well, why do I need to invest in something like this? Show me the bad guys. Show me the empirical evidence that we have an issue. So, you know, something like this, the Insider Threat PenTest, can help you, you know, essentially gain that buy-in that you need. And we see a lot of organizations struggle with that, especially nowadays. You know, budgets are getting tight, things are getting squeezed, but you know, lead from the bottom up, essentially.
So we were talking earlier. University of Maryland has it's called the intelligence. It's an applied research laboratory for intelligence and security. The certification is called Global Insider Threat Certification Program, or GITCP. It's pretty new, within the last 2 years. It has criteria, has ongoing. If you look at that University of Maryland sponsored program, it's supposed to be the burgeoning insider threat certification. So it's pretty neat, something to look into.
And the last one is from, what's it called? The one from Canada. There's one from Canada which also does pretty good training and has a program as well. I think it's the Canadian Insider Risk Symposium. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but the University of Maryland one is a great resource as well.
All right, everybody.
Okay, we're at
Thank you so
time.
much.